Welcome to BrainTalk, a podcast brought to you by the Center for Early Detection, Assessment, and Response to Risk, located at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center.
Conversations that explore the brain and innovative therapies to help young people at risk.
Hi, I'm Julia.
And I'm Eddie.
And with us today we have Dr. Matcheri Keshavan, a consulting psychiatrist and researcher here at the Cedar Clinic.
Dr. Keshavan is currently the Stanley Cobb Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and Vice Chair of Psychiatry at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center.
Additionally, Dr. Keshavan has over 20 years of experience researching the neurobiological basis and early intervention in early course schizophrenia. In this time, Dr. Keshavan has completed over 490 publications and has been awarded many honors for his outstanding teaching and research.
So good to have you today, Dr. Keshavan. So before we get started, I was just kind of curious on your personal background, maybe your primary area of research and how you became interested in this line of work.
Okay. Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity to talk about what I do. I'm a psychiatrist. I have been interested in the diagnosis and the biological basis and the treatment of schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders for over 30 years now. Ever since I finished medical school and my psychiatry residency, I started taking care of patients with this kind of illnesses, and I've been really interested to learn what really happens in the brain that causes these illnesses and what can we do to treat and prevent these disorders. So it's very important for us to understand what causes these cognitive problems and what we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Thanks so much for being here with us today and sharing a little bit of your history. It sounds like understanding a basis of cognition and really intervening early on in the course of illness is really important. And as young adults, Eddie and I both, people are always telling us that our brains are still developing, that we should be careful, wear helmets, all of that. So could you talk a little bit more about what exactly is going on in the adolescent brain and why it's still forming, and maybe some strategies that can be used to intervene early?
Well, contrary to what people used to think, even as recently as 30, 40 years ago, we now know that the brain does not stop developing at birth. It continues to develop and mature for at least 2 to 3 decades after birth, during childhood and adolescence. Now, how exactly does the brain develop during adolescence? There is a lot that we have learned in the last 2 decades. Initially, in childhood, the brain grows in size and develops lots of nerve cells and connections. But a point will come during the early adolescence when the brain says there is too much connections here, too many neurons, too many cells. So we have to become more efficient. So there is a inbuilt process in which the brain slightly shrinks in size during adolescence. This is the typical period when the brain actually loses some gray matter. This is what we call pruning. It's like a garden that has overgrown with too many shrubs and weeds and plants and so forth. The gardener has to come and prune it to the right level. So that pruning process happens during adolescence. And in some disease conditions, this pruning might become excessive. If that pruning becomes excessive, that causes some diseases like schizophrenia. So it's important to know how exactly the brain develops and how that development could go wrong. And understanding that will tell us about what causes schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders.
Mm-hmm. So what exactly, or what might put someone at higher risk for their brain maybe pruning in excess?
Those are important questions. The brain um, is developed uh, by an interaction between learning as we grow and our genetic machinery. It's an interaction between genes and the environment. About a half of all the genes that we have are expressed in the brain. So the genes are very important in determining how our brain develops in health or in disease. But at the same time, the genes do not work in a vacuum. They work with environmental factors. That includes the education we get, how our families interact, how our parents are upbringing the children. Also extraneous factors like drug abuse, head injury, nutrition. All of those have a role to play in determining whether a person develops normally into a healthy adult or whether that process of development gets derailed in some way or the other.
Okay, Dr. Keshavan. So, from what you're saying, I'm learning that the development in the young adult brain is a combination of genes and environment. So, I was just personally wondering, is there any way I can exercise my brain, or is there a way I can manipulate my environment to lead to greater growth?
Absolutely. Now think of the brain as like a computer. Okay? Different parts of our brain are similar to the different parts of a computer. So there is the microprocessor in the brain, the part of the brain that processes information. And there is a hard drive in the brain, like the hippocampus, which stores memories, and so forth. So there are different components of the brain that function like a computer in different ways. But there is one big difference between a computer and the brain, and that is the computer doesn't build itself. And the computer doesn't take its inputs and change its own internal circuit board. The brain has the ability to use the information from its life experience and sculpt itself, rewire itself throughout the lifetime, but especially so in childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. This process of rewiring the brain itself in an ongoing way, sculpting itself, reshaping itself, and learning from experience is what is called plasticity. It's like plastic that can be molded. Think of brain as as something that you can shape and reshape like a plasticine mold. Okay. So, given that the brain has this ability to modify itself from experience, learning becomes very important as a way of shaping the brain towards better functioning and towards better health. So, just like, think of muscles. How do you build your muscle? You build it by exercise. And too much exercise causes strain and sprain, and the muscles might actually get injured. Too little might make the brain not develop properly. So the right kind of exercise and at the right time keeps the brain growing and also in good shape. Also, think of the different parts of the brain like different muscles. There is the memory part of the brain, there is the attention part of the brain, there is the emotion part of the brain, there is the socialization part of the brain. All of those require appropriate optimum levels of exercise. So keeping the brain nourished by exercise actually is a way of building a healthy, functioning brain with all its muscles, if you will.
Does exercising one of those parts of the brain influence another? Like, do they influence each other, or does exercising kind of help?
That's a very good question. They may, to some extent. If, for example, you build exclusively your memory muscle, it may help your general intelligence as well. It may help your problem-solving ability as well. But then you become more of a memory expert, and it will be an asymmetric development. But on the other hand, if you are constantly playing on a video game and you become faster at it, it doesn't necessarily mean that your memory is getting better. So an ideal development in childhood and adolescence requires an optimum balance between different aspects of our mental functioning and development. Any one of them taken to an extreme may not be so optimal.
Could you possibly describe an example of a brain exercise? Do you mostly use kind of computerized exercises in research, or are there other forms?
So when we use the word cognition, when we want to improve cognition, it's important to know that cognition is not just one thing. There are broadly two categories of thinking abilities or cognition. One broad category would be like the basic cognitive functions of attention, memory, problem solving, your verbal knowledge, verbal fluency, and things like that. And then there is another group of what we would call social cognition, and that is the ability to gauge the other person's emotions, look at someone's face and figure out that that person is not willing to talk, or is not happy, or is angry, or is happy, and so on. And then appropriately modify your own responses based on the social context. That ability is also cognition, but it is a different kind of cognitive set of skills. We use the term social cognition for that. Computer-based exercises, like your video games, are good for the first type of cognitive skills. So if you want to get faster in your reaction times, if you want to get better memory, games on computers are pretty good. So that's one way of improving cognition. I mean, you could also use paper and pencil kind of exercises. A lot of things that we do on the classroom of learning math or language and so forth is basically improving those abilities in our brain. The second set of skills, namely the social cognition skills, are best taught and learned by individual therapy, like coaching on a one-on-one basis, or in group sessions, where the person has the ability to interact with several other people so that you can practice skills of reading other people's emotions, judging what is appropriate and what's not appropriate in a given social context, and learning how to use your emotions effectively. Those sets of skills are best taught in group settings or individual therapy settings. So there is no one approach to improve cognition. There are the computer-based exercises, and then there are the individual and group exercises.
And the best would kind of be the optimal balance.
Optimal combination of different approaches in a stepwise manner. So it's a very important principle. Just take the physical exercise analogy back again. If you want to become a marathon runner, be ready for the next Boston Marathon, you don't go straight away and start running 5 miles a day. You want to start walking regularly, then go for short distances, generally improve your physical fitness, and then keep progressively building. So any improvement in cognition is best done in a systematic, stepwise, progressive manner.
Mm-hmm.
So, from what you're saying, these cognitive exercises definitely do have clinical applications in helping someone who might be at clinical high risk. I was just wondering if you can explain what clinical high risk was?
Okay, so I mentioned to you about these serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and psychotic depression and so forth. They typically begin in late teenage years or early adulthood. However, in most cases, these diseases do not begin abruptly like a light turning off or on. typically there is a period of weeks, months, or years when people show milder signs of something not being right that go back many months or even years prior to the onset of the first psychotic episode. And it is possible to identify and diagnose people in these earliest phases of illness. And the term used for such phase of illness is what is called the prodromal phase. A better term for that is clinical high risk. So these are individuals who, based on their clinical symptoms that we are identifying, like personality changes, mild difficulties in thinking, or concentration problems, social withdrawal, and so forth. These symptoms, when we identify them in a clinical context, we consider them to indicate the person is at a high risk for something more serious happening down the road. This is why we use the term clinical high risk. And so this is to be distinguished from people who we identify as being at risk because of a family history of a serious mental illness like schizophrenia and so on. So whether there is a family history or not, if individuals in their teenage years or young adulthood are beginning to show symptoms of a social withdrawal, a mild thought disorder, perceptual disturbances kind of experiences, we consider them as being at clinical high risk. And current research is beginning to show that early intervention in the clinical high risk using psychotherapeutic treatments like CBT and cognitive enhancement therapy and so forth can actually make them better as well as potentially prevent more serious problems happening down the road.
So would you consider like cognitive deficits or social isolation as warning signs or predictor signs for
Yes.
someone at
So
clinical
the
risk?
current research is beginning to show that cognitive impairment, when I say cognition, it refers to a number of features like memory, attention, problem-solving ability, social cognition, and so forth. Cognitive impairments as well as a decline in cognition over a period of time both indicate the risk for serious mental illness down the road. A high school student, for example, who is beginning to drop grades without a good explanation for it would be a good example of that. And cognitive impairment is only one of the features, and as I said, certain symptoms, sometimes mood changes like depression, anxiety, or perceptual changes or thinking difficulties, feeling like you're not safe, feeling like somehow things are not going right in your surroundings, feeling like you can't trust people, or unusual perceptual experiences, or difficulty to put one's thoughts together. All of those are symptoms of clinical high risk. So a combination of cognitive impairment and the symptoms would make one consider the likelihood of a clinical high risk syndrome.
And about of people who might be considered to be at high risk if it's intervened early and they participate in types of cognitive enhancement therapy or psychotherapy treatments, what is the probability that they would improve and not develop a full-on mental illness?
Well, at this time, what we do know is that those kinds of treatments like cognitive enhancement and cognitive behavioral therapy are quite effective in improving symptoms of people in the early phases of psychotic illness. Now the question whether these interventions actually prevent episodes of psychosis later is something that has to be researched. We are conducting studies at this time to see whether these treatments compared to standard treatment as usual or other forms of supportive psychotherapy are better in preventing the first psychotic episode.
So, from my understanding, cognitive enhancement therapy combines neurocognitive training exercises with social skills training groups. So I was kind of interested on like the relationship between the two, and how they both play a big role in increasing someone's cognition.
So, what research tells us is that there are, basic cognitive abilities like memory and attention, um, and problem-solving abilities, and then there are the higher order cognitive functions like emotion recognition, figuring out what is there in the other person's mind, what we call theory of mind, uh, knowing how to appraise social context, all of those what we call social cognitive processes. What studies have found is that they are highly related to each other. They're not the same, but they are related to each other. And what is also shown through research is that improving one without improving the other is generally less effective. Whereas a combined treatment of both of those kinds of cognitive abilities actually has a synergistic effect, which means the effectiveness of that even more than either of them by alone added together.
So what would the benefit be of an individual participating in both?
The benefit would be the efficacy being better, and the effectiveness of a social skills training is enhanced by improving the person's speed of mental processing and memory and attention. So if you want to improve communication in a social setting, you want to be able to improve that person's quickness of comprehension of what's happening in the social context. And also, in order to be effective in social communication, you need to be able to remember what you just said a few minutes ago.
That makes sense.
Right? So memory is important. You also need to be able to problem solve, so that if one solution, one approach is not working, you have to flexibly change your mind and come up with alternative solutions. So that is called executive ability or executive function. So all of those are cognitive functions that are needed for effective social communication.
Do we happen to know where these treatments affect the brain, in which areas they affect?
Yeah, so studies are beginning to show that cognitive enhancement therapies generally have a positive effect across the entire brain, but probably to different extents in different parts of the brain, depending on what particular aspect of cognition is being, exercised. For example, if you train somebody consistently in one aspect of cognition, that particular muscle in the brain will change more prominently. To give you an example, a study in England showed that taxi drivers who were driving these London highly complicated London roads without GPS had much bigger hippocampus. Hippocampus is the kind of internal GPS in our brains. So if you regularly use the hippocampus grows. Likewise, if you use your brain continuously to solve problems by juggling different combinations in a chess move, you need the frontal cortex for that. The frontal lobe might get stronger. So depending on what type of cognitive skills are being trained, different parts of the brain might change. The ideal cognitive enhancement program should be a combination of all of those. Just like an ideal exercise regime, when you go to a personal trainer, he's going to tell you not just to keep flexing your biceps alone. You need to do a little bit of strength training, you need to do a little bit of aerobic, you need to do a little bit of coordination training, you need to give a little bit of rest in between. Okay. So a combination works much better.
Do you think that now that we are using like smartphones that tell us everything, where to go all the time, we constantly have this GPS and something that helps us remember things like to-do lists and people's contacts. I just anecdotally, it seems like less people know anybody's phone numbers or know how to get anywhere. Do you think that our brains maybe are worse than they used to be because of that?
That's a real concern, I would say, is because increasingly, because of smartphones, we are kind of outsourcing our own brains to external devices. So not much is left for the brain to do when everything is done by your smartphone, right? Unless you are doing things that computers can't do. You know, if you're a programmer that actually builds the software, a programmer cannot, a smartphone cannot make you do that. Or if you are, a psychotherapist trying to help another person through a social interaction, thankfully so far, smartphones are not able to do that. So, but the risk nowadays is that so many and increasingly a larger number of our day-to-day activities are being delegated to the smartphones and other connected devices. The risk might be that someday we may end up atrophying or shrinking some parts of our brain. I would not rule out that as a concern.
Maybe another spin on it could be that while we do outsource some of our activities to the phones, we might have more time to focus on other aspects of our brain. So we might be growing in different aspects. Like we might not be spending all the time to memorize phone numbers, but could it be possible that we would rather learn more English or learn different languages or specify in more specific information?
That would be good. But it seems people maybe spend that time playing video games.
Provided the person is disciplined enough to engage the brain in other activities while basic functions are delegated to the smartphones. But the one problem with the smartphones and other such devices is that they get so addictive. And since they make life so easy, that the default is not to do anything other than relying increasingly on smartphones alone. And that would be a risky situation.
Yeah. So, what we've learned so far is that cognitive enhancement therapy is really useful in people who are at clinical high risk and for people who aren't, right, Dr. Keshavan?
Yeah, they are useful. We already know that such treatments are useful in people who are already experiencing an illness like schizophrenia.
Yeah.
We are beginning to test the question whether they might be helpful in people at clinical high risk. But what you're saying is that they may be helpful to people who don't have any problem either. Like otherwise healthy individuals, can we improve their brain function by cognitive enhancement interventions? My answer to that would be yes. After all of education is kind of cognitive enhancement anyway. So, it's like exercise that schools teach us. Anything that you learn is exercising your brain. And so one cannot deny that, this kind of intervention is applicable to almost everybody, whether it's young people or older people, whether it's people with illnesses or without illnesses. An appropriate form of cognitive exercise which is neither too much nor too little and tailored to the individual's own life goals and situations is what one needs to go with.
Thank you so much. That's a really great note to end on. So just to wrap up a little bit, maybe you could I could summarize some of the things you said, and if you have anything to add. A key point is just what is cognition and understanding both the basic cognitive functions, including memory, concentration, ability to think, organize, and that hand in hand with social cognition and your ability to respond effectively and appropriately in social situations and kind of gauging someone else's emotions or experiences, and how those two categories sort of work together to form cognition. And also important to remember that our brains are still, during adolescence, are shrinking a little bit, pruning the garden a bit, and that potentially that could happen a little bit too much. But with proper cognitive enhancement therapies and treatments that engage both parts of cognition, we could prevent that.
Well, thank you very much. I guess in the next interview you're going to hear more about the actual approaches to cognitive enhancement in people at clinical high risk for serious mental illnesses by Dr. Michelle Friedman-Jacobi.
Thank you for coming in today, Dr. Keshavan.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank
I
you.
learned a lot.
I did too. Thank you.
Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of BrainTalk. Thanks for listening.
For more information about helping young people at risk and for future episodes of BrainTalk, please visit the Cedar Clinic website at www.cedarclinic.org.